February the 8th, 2021. As the UK endured another winter lockdown, a quiet announcement marked the end of an era. The 97-year-old fashion label, Wallis, had been sold for £25.2 million. But the buyer didn't want the shops. Overnight, 214 physical stores were condemned to permanent closure. What happened to this jewel of the British High Street? For decades, Wallis was the destination for accessible luxury, bringing the elegance of Parisian couture to shopping centres across the country. It was the go-to boutique for sophisticated tailoring, premium coats, and its revolutionary petite ranges. Generations of women remembered the quiet prestige of browsing its well-lit aisles on a Saturday afternoon. But flash forward to the 2020s, and that tangible legacy was ruthlessly discarded. The bustling shop floors, carefully dressed mannequins, and dedicated staff were replaced by dark windows and empty retail units. The physical soul of the brand was stripped away, leaving nothing but a digital ghost in a fast fashion portfolio. How does a venerable 97-year-old fashion institution built on quality and exclusivity end up as merely a brand name without a single physical shop? It wasn't just the pandemic, and it wasn't just the rise of online shopping. It was a story of corporate greed, loss of identity, and the slow decay of the Arcadia Empire. London, 1923 to 2021. The disappearance of Wallis reveals the brutal reality of modern retail and what happens when the high street loses its soul to the digital cart. To understand the tragedy of how Wallis ended up as a faceless digital entity, one must first understand the physical craft from which it was born. Long before the era of disposable fashion, when garments were designed to be worn for a season and discarded, clothing in Britain was an investment. In the early 1920s, the disparity between the bespoke couture of London's West End and the mass-produced, often poorly fitted garments available to the everyday woman was vast. High fashion was locked behind the gilded doors of Mayfair, inaccessible to the average shopper walking the local high street. It was into this divide that Raphael Nat Wallis stepped in 1923. He did not choose the affluent avenues of Knightsbridge for his first venture. Instead, he opened his doors in Chapel Market, Islington, a bustling working-class commercial hub in North London. Chapel Market was a place of noise, commerce, and practical living. Here, Raphael Wallis established a business focused on what was, at the time, the single most important garment in a British woman's wardrobe: the mantle. In early 20th century terminology, a mantle was a lady's coat or cloak. Given the notoriously damp and freezing British winters, a coat was not merely an accessory, it was an armor against the elements. A woman might own only a few dresses, but her coat was worn every single day. It announced her respectability, her status, and her taste to the outside world. Raphael Wallis understood that the women of Islington, and indeed women across the country, desired coats that offered both warmth and an undeniable sense of style, without the exorbitant price tag of a West End tailor. What set Wallis apart from the very beginning was its operational model. Rather than acting purely as a retailer, buying finished goods wholesale and selling them at a markup, Raphael Wallis was a manufacturer. He established his own in-house workshops. Behind the retail floor, the air was thick with the scent of pressed wool and tailoring chalk. Heavy cast-iron sewing machines hummed late into the evening. By controlling the entire process from the sourcing of heavy woolens to the final stitch on a lapel, Wallis could guarantee a level of quality control that his local competitors simply could not match. He cut out the middleman, ensuring that the savings were passed directly to his customers, while the standard of the tailoring remained meticulously high. Throughout the late 1920s and into the 1930s, the Wallis reputation steadily grew. The business expanded beyond its single shop in Chapel Market, planting the seeds of what would become a formidable chain. But this early momentum was brutally interrupted by the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. The war years brought unprecedented challenges to the British high street. Blackouts darkened shop windows, staff were conscripted into the war effort, and supply chains were entirely disrupted. In 1941, the British government introduced clothes rationing, followed by the Utility Clothing Scheme. Consumers were issued coupon books, and strict regulations were placed on the amount of cloth, the number of buttons, and the type of trimmings that could be used on any single garment. Fashion, in the traditional sense, was suspended. Yet, counterintuitively, the austere conditions of the war years cemented the Wallis reputation. Because coupons were so precious, women could not afford to waste them on poorly made clothing that would fray or fall apart after a few months. When a British woman spent her hard-earned coupons on a heavy winter coat, she needed it to last for years. A Wallis coat, with its sturdy in-house manufacturing and superior tailoring, became a highly coveted asset. It was an investment in endurance. The immediate post-war years offered little respite. While the fighting had stopped, the economic hardship continued. The government imposed a crippling purchase tax on consumer goods, effectively acting as a luxury tax that squeezed both retailers and shoppers. The tension within the Wallis boardroom was palpable. How does a business built on offering a touch of attainable luxury survive in an economy where luxury is heavily penalized by the state? The answer, once again, lay in uncompromising quality and clever adaptation. As the 1950s dawned, the somber, utilitarian silhouettes of the war years were suddenly swept away by the influence of Christian Dior's new look, characterized by nipped-in waists, soft shoulders, and voluminous skirts. It was a celebration of femininity and fabric. Wallis, with its agile in-house manufacturing, was perfectly positioned to interpret these sweeping Parisian silhouettes and tailor them for the British high street. They navigated the heavy taxes by ensuring that every garment they produced was unequivocally worth the price. By the end of the 1950s, Raphael Nat Wallis had not just built a shop, he had forged a respected British institution. The single Islington storefront had multiplied into a recognized regional chain, built entirely on the reputation of the perfectly cut mantle and the exquisitely tailored dress. The foundation was solid, woven from decades of surviving economic depressions, world wars, and rationing. But as the conservative 50s gave way to the cultural explosion of the swinging 60s, the baton was about to be passed. The founders' sons were stepping into the business, and they harbored a vision that would take the Wallis name out of the practical realm of winter coats and thrust it directly into the glamorous heart of European high fashion. As the swinging 60s gave way to the 1970s, the British high street was undergoing a profound transformation. The austere, practical shopping habits of the post-war generation were being replaced by a bold, consumer-driven desire for glamour and self-expression. At Wallis, the mantle of leadership had passed from Raphael Nat Wallis to his sons, Geoffrey and Sidney. They inherited a robust manufacturing base and a reputation for quality, but they possessed a completely different vision for the brand's future. They did not just want to clothe the women of Britain, they wanted to dress them in the height of European fashion. The great tension for any mid-market retailer is the gap between aspiration and affordability. High fashion was dictated by the couture houses of Paris, Dior, Chanel, Givenchy, whose garments cost more than the average British worker earned in a year. The Wallis brothers saw an opportunity to bridge this gap. They pioneered a strategy that would define the brand's golden era, the Paris pick-offs. In an audacious move, Geoffrey Wallis and his team of buyers and designers became fixtures at the exclusive Paris Fashion Week shows. They would sit front row, meticulously observing the hemlines, the cuts, the fabrics, and the silhouettes of the new season's couture. Before the models had even finished their final walk, the Wallis team was already sprinting for the airport. They would fly back to London, sketching frantically from memory, and immediately set their in-house pattern cutters and machinists to work. Because Wallis still owned its manufacturing and possessed decades of tailoring expertise, they could translate a Parisian couture concept into a high-quality, high-street-ready garment in a matter of weeks. This was not the cheap, disposable, fast fashion of the 21st century. These were meticulously crafted homages made with premium fabrics and proper linings. For the first time, a secretary in Leeds or a teacher in Birmingham could walk into her local high street and purchase a tailored suit or an elegant evening dress that possessed the unmistakable flair of the Champs-Élysées, all at a fraction of the couture price tag. Wallis democratized luxury. The brand became the worst-kept secret of stylish British women, a place where one could find designer looks without the designer label. This strategy propelled Wallis into a period of aggressive, triumphant expansion. The crown jewel of this era was the opening of their massive flagship store on London's Oxford Street. It was a statement of intent. Wallis was no longer just a respected coatmaker from Islington. It was a premier fashion destination standing shoulder to shoulder with the giants of British retail. The Oxford Street store was a theatre of retail, boasting sweeping staircases, plush carpets, and window displays that rivaled the most exclusive boutiques in Mayfair. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Wallis family's tenure was their recognition of a severely underserved demographic. In the 1980s, standard sizing on the British high street was notoriously rigid. If a woman was under 5'3", buying clothes meant either swimming in excess fabric or spending additional money on expensive alterations. Wallis revolutionized the market by launching its dedicated petite range. This was not simply a matter of shortening hems. The Wallis designers entirely re-engineered their patterns. They adjusted the placement of darts, the slope of the shoulders, and the proportions of the waistlines to perfectly fit a smaller frame. It was a masterclass in understanding the consumer. The introduction of the petite range bred a level of fierce, multi-generational brand loyalty that most retailers can only dream of. A Wallis customer knew that she could walk into the shop, pick a garment off the rail, and it would fit her flawlessly. To shop at Wallis during this period was to engage in a specific ritual of British retail. It was the destination for occasion wear, the outfit for a job interview, a wedding, or a crucial business meeting. The shop floors were hushed and elegant. The shop assistants were not merely till operators. They were knowledgeable staff who understood tailoring, could advise on fit, and offered a level of personal service that elevated the entire experience. It felt like a premium boutique, even if it was located in a provincial shopping centre. By the late 1980s, Wallis had achieved a delicate, almost impossible balance. It had expanded into a formidable chain, with dozens of locations across the country. Yet, it had miraculously retained its aura of exclusivity and premium quality. It was a beloved fixture of the British high street, profitable and prestigious. However, the sheer scale of this success was inadvertently planting the seeds for the brand's eventual loss of independence. The retail landscape of the 1990s was becoming increasingly corporatized. The era of the independent, family-run national chain was drawing to a close, replaced by the age of the retail conglomerate. Wallis had become too big, too profitable, and too prominent to ignore. The wolves of corporate acquisition were beginning to circle, and the Parisian dream that the Wallis family had built was about to be swallowed by a very different kind of empire. The dawn of the 1990s brought a seismic shift to the British high street. The era of the proud, independent family chain was drawing to a close, replaced by an aggressive new age of corporate consolidation. Retail was no longer just about selling clothes. It was about economies of scale, shareholder dividends, and market dominance. Wallis, with its robust sales, premium positioning, and enviable reputation, was simply too valuable a prize to remain independent. The family business, built on the hum of sewing machines in Islington and the thrill of the Parisian runway, was about to be absorbed into the sterile architecture of corporate holding companies. The first major transition saw Wallis fall under the umbrella of Sears plc. Not to be confused with the American department store, the British Sears was a sprawling conglomerate that at its zenith monopolized footwear and owned a formidable stable of fashion brands, including Miss Selfridge, Warehouse, and Richards. For Wallis, joining Sears was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it provided the financial muscle to secure prime retail spots in the gleaming new indoor shopping centres that were springing up across the United Kingdom, from Meadowhall in Sheffield to the Metro Centre in Gateshead. On the other, it began to strip the brand of its agility and its soul. Under the Sears regime, Wallis was no longer the sole priority of its owners. It was merely one division within a vast, complex portfolio. The brand was forced to compete for investment and attention against its sister chains. The legendary in-house manufacturing, the very foundation of Raphael Wallis's promise of accessible luxury and superior quality control, was gradually dismantled. Corporate logic dictated that producing garments in British workshops was too expensive. To maintain profit margins and satisfy the boardroom, production was increasingly outsourced to cheaper factories overseas. The clothing remained popular, and Wallis successfully retained its positioning as a premium high street destination, but the meticulous, almost obsessive craftsmanship of the early decades began to quietly erode. Wallis was being transformed from a bespoke fashion house into a high-volume retail engine. But Sears itself was a lumbering giant, slow to react to the changing tastes of the 1990s consumer. By the end of the decade, the conglomerate was bloated, struggling with outdated logistics and underperforming divisions. This scent of vulnerability attracted one of the most formidable, controversial, and ruthless figures in British retail history, Philip Green. In 1999, Green orchestrated a £548 million takeover of Sears. It was a masterclass in aggressive financial maneuvering. Green had little interest in operating the unwieldy Sears empire long-term. He was an asset manager, identifying the jewels within the crown, extracting them, and discarding the rest. The women's wear division, which included Wallis, alongside Miss Selfridge and Warehouse, was immediately identified as prime real estate. Just months after acquiring Sears, Green struck a lucrative deal with another high street titan. He sold the Sears women's wear brands to the Arcadia Group for £151 million. At the time, Arcadia was already a colossal force in British retail, controlling familiar household names like Topshop, Dorothy Perkins, Evans and Burton. Overnight, Wallis became a pawn in a much larger game of high street monopoly. It was slotted into the Arcadia matrix, officially becoming part of the largest clothing retailer in the United Kingdom. The Arcadia strategy was one of total saturation. Walk down any high street or into any regional shopping centre at the turn of the millennium, and you were essentially walking into a closed Arcadia ecosystem. A teenager would shop at Miss Selfridge or Topshop. Her mother might browse Dorothy Perkins. And for premium office wear, a tailored suit, or a sophisticated winter coat, she would be directed straight to Wallis. On paper, the Arcadia takeover looked like an absolute triumph. Wallis benefited from immense buying power, shared distribution networks, and prime placement in multi-brand outfit stores located in the booming out-of-town retail parks. Sales figures were robust. The shops were consistently busy. The tills were ringing. Yet, beneath the surface of this corporate synergy, a fatal tension was taking root. Wallis had entirely lost its autonomy. It was no longer a brand that dictated its own future. Its survival was now inextricably linked to the health of the Arcadia Group. The brilliant buyers who used to sprint back from Paris with sketchpads were replaced by corporate merchandisers focused heavily on yield per square foot and rigid supply chains. Within the Arcadia hierarchy, Wallis was repositioned firmly as the older sister, a brand explicitly targeted at the mature professional woman. While this provided a steady, reliable demographic, it also quietly boxed the brand in the relentless machinery of a massive retail conglomerate. A brand that stops innovating to capture new audiences and relies solely on a fixed, aging customer base is a brand living on borrowed time. As the new millennium dawned, Wallis stood at a precarious crossroads. It was highly visible and deeply embedded in the British shopping experience, yet it was tethered to a corporate giant that was about to undergo an even more dramatic transformation. Philip Green, having sold Wallis to Arcadia in 1999, had not finished with the British high street. He was watching the Arcadia Group closely, preparing a move that would define the next 2 decades of British retail and ultimately seal the fate of every brand trapped within its grasp. If the 1990s marked the loss of Wallis's independence, the year 2002 marked its complete absorption into an absolute monarchy. Philip Green, having previously flipped the brand, returned to swallow the entire Arcadia Group in an audacious £850 million takeover. He took the sprawling retail giant private, delisting it from the London Stock Exchange. In doing so, he became the undisputed king of the British High Street, and Wallis became a jewel firmly locked within his private crown. To understand Wallis during this era is to understand the sheer, overwhelming scale of the Arcadia machine in the mid-2000s. The group was an omnipresent force, It controlled roughly 12% of the UK clothing market. Walk into any major shopping centre, from the Trafford Centre in Manchester to Bluewater in Kent, and the Arcadia portfolio formed the architectural anchor of the entire complex. Wallis sat comfortably alongside Topshop, Dorothy Perkins, Burton, Evans and Miss Selfridge. The brands were often situated adjacent to one another, creating an unavoidable wall of Arcadia-owned commerce. For Wallis, the early years of the Green Era were characterized by a massive, highly efficient boom in visibility and profit. The brand benefited enormously from Arcadia's unparalleled negotiating power. Suppliers were squeezed for better margins, logistics were streamlined, and rent deals were aggressively negotiated. But perhaps the most significant physical shift for Wallis during this decade was its expansion out of the traditional town centre and into the burgeoning retail parks. The 2000s saw the rapid ascent of the outfit concept, a vast, purpose-built, out-of-town megastore entirely owned by Arcadia. These enormous sheds, surrounded by acres of free car parks, were designed to house all of the group's brands under a single cavernous roof. For the time-poor consumer, outfit was a revelation. A family could drive to their local retail park on a Sunday, park directly outside, and shop for teenagers, fathers and grandmothers simultaneously. Within these massive outfit stores, Wallis was given dedicated, prominent floor space. It operated as the premium, sophisticated anchor for the older, wealthier female demographic. It was the section of the store where the lighting was slightly warmer. The mannequins were posed with a touch more elegance, and the rails were lined with sensible but stylish office wear, heavy winter coats, and tasteful occasion dresses. Financially, this model was incredibly lucrative. The tills rarely stopped ringing. The footfall generated by the sheer convenience of the retail park was staggering. Yet, this shift profoundly altered the psychological experience of shopping at Wallis. The brand that had once prided itself on providing a hushed, boutique-like atmosphere, a slice of Paris in the provinces, was now just one department within a giant retail warehouse. The dedicated, highly trained shop assistants, who once understood the intricacies of tailoring and the specific needs of the petite customer, were increasingly replaced by general staff who floated between brands. The transaction became highly efficient, but the emotional connection, the sense of occasion that once defined a trip to Wallis, was quietly being diluted. By 2005, the Arcadia Group appeared entirely invincible. It was generating colossal amounts of cash, cementing Philip Green's reputation as a retail genius. This perceived invincibility culminated in a moment that would later come to define the entire tragic trajectory of the empire: the £1.2 billion dividend. In a move that stunned the City of London, Green extracted a record-breaking £1.2 billion dividend from Arcadia, paying it directly to his wife, who resided in the tax haven of Monaco. At the time, it was celebrated as a masterstroke of business acumen. But on the shop floors of Wallis, the reality of this massive capital extraction was beginning to manifest in subtle, insidious ways. When over £1 billion is removed from a retail business, that money is not being spent on the things that ensure long-term survival. It is not being spent on refurbishing tired stores. It is not being spent on upgrading antiquated IT systems. And crucially, for a brand like Wallis, it is not being spent on maintaining the quality of the product. The pressure to maintain astronomical profit margins slowly began to degrade the very essence of what made Wallis desirable. The brand had built its reputation on premium fabrics, heavy wools, fine silks, and durable linings. But under the aggressive cost-cutting regime of the mid-2000s, compromises were quietly made. The tailoring still looked sharp on the hanger, but a perceptive customer could feel the difference. Wool blends featured increasing percentages of synthetic fibers. The stitching was less robust. The linings felt slightly cheaper. The meticulous Paris pick-offs of the past were replaced by safer, more generic designs produced in mass-market overseas factories. Furthermore, the physical environment of the traditional high street stores began to suffer. While the out-of-town outfit stores were relatively new, many of the original Wallis locations on local high streets were aging rapidly. Without adequate capital investment, the carpets grew threadbare. The shop fittings looked dated. The lighting, crucial for selling premium clothing, often felt harsh or inadequate. Despite these creeping issues, the warning signs were entirely masked by the sheer volume of sales. The loyal Wallis customer, the woman in her 40s or 50s who had grown up trusting the brand for her workwear and winter coats, did not abandon the shop overnight. She continued to visit out of habit and loyalty. This provided Arcadia with a dangerous illusion of security. The executives looking at the spreadsheets in their London headquarters saw a brand that was performing reliably, generating steady cash from a dependable, albeit aging, demographic. But retail is a forward-looking industry, and a brand living solely on the loyalty of its past is uniquely vulnerable. As the 2000s drew to a close, Wallis was a highly visible, profitable entity, but it had entirely stopped innovating. It was a brand operating on autopilot, starved of meaningful investment, and deeply complacent. It assumed that its loyal customers would remain forever, and that the high street would continue to function as it always had. They could not have been more wrong. A technological and cultural tsunami was gathering on the horizon, and the bloated, slow-moving Arcadia empire was structurally incapable of outrunning it. As the calendar ticked over into the 2000s, the British high street was about to experience a tectonic shift. For decades, the rhythm of retail had been dictated by a rigid, predictable calendar. The spring/summer collection and the autumn/winter collection, punctuated by the January sales and the mid-season markdowns. Wallis had operated on this traditional timeline for generations. Buyers would commit to fabrics and designs months in advance, placing massive orders with overseas factories and praying that their predictions about color and silhouette would resonate with the British consumer half a year later. But this comfortable, predictable world was about to be obliterated. A new breed of European fashion giants had arrived on British soil, and they brought with them a weapon that the Arcadia Group fundamentally lacked: speed. The most devastating disruptor in the physical retail space was the Spanish giant, Zara. Zara did not work on 6-month lead times. By vertically integrating their supply chain and keeping manufacturing closer to home, they could spot a trend on a celebrity on a Tuesday, design a homage on Wednesday, and have it hanging on the rails in their Oxford Street store within 3 weeks. It was an industrialized, hyper-accelerated version of the very Paris pick-off strategy that the Wallis brothers had pioneered in the 1970s. But whereas Wallis had done it with a few select garments, Zara was doing it across their entire inventory, constantly rotating stock so that the shop floor looked completely different every single week. Simultaneously, at the other end of the market, the Irish behemoth Primark was expanding rapidly across the UK, offering an entirely different threat: unassailable volume and rock-bottom prices. Primark turned clothing into a disposable commodity. Women no longer needed to invest in a coat or a dress. They could buy an entire outfit for the price of a round of drinks, wear it once, and discard it. Caught in the crossfire of this fast fashion revolution, Wallis looked increasingly sluggish and overpriced. Its garments were still respectable, but they lacked the immediate, thrilling novelty of Zara, and they certainly could not compete with the sheer affordability of Primark. A Wallis coat, which might retail for £80 or £90, suddenly felt like an enormous financial commitment to a consumer base that was being conditioned to expect instant gratification for a fraction of the cost. The heavy, slow-moving supply chains of the Arcadia Empire were entirely unsuited to this new, frenetic pace of retail. If the arrival of agile physical competitors was a severe blow, the second wave of the tsunami was catastrophic. The early 2000s saw the rapid proliferation of the smartphone and the explosive growth of broadband internet. Shopping was no longer an activity confined to a Saturday afternoon trip to the local shopping center or the out-of-town retail park. It was happening on the morning commute, during the lunch break, and late at night on the sofa. A new generation of pure-play online retailers, companies with no physical shops at all, began to aggressively capture market share. Brands like ASOS and a rapidly growing Manchester-based operation named Boohoo were rewriting the rules of British fashion. Unburdened by the crippling costs of high street leases, expensive shop fittings, and extortionate business rates, these digital-first companies poured all their capital into logistics, algorithmic marketing, and vast, highly efficient distribution warehouses. Within the boardrooms of the Arcadia Group, there was a fatal underestimation of this digital threat. Online retail was viewed by the old guard not as the future of the business, but merely as a secondary, supplementary channel, a digital catalogue to support the physical shops. Wallis's e-commerce platform was built on clunky, legacy IT systems. The website was slow, the photography was uninspiring, and the delivery options were inflexible compared to the next day, tracked services being pioneered by the pure plays. There was also a dangerous assumption within Arcadia that the core Wallis demographic, the mature, professional woman in her 40s, 50s and beyond, would remain loyal to physical shopping. They believed she would always want to feel the fabric, try the garment on in a fitting room, and speak to a shop assistant. But this was a severe miscalculation. The Silver Surfer demographic was adopting tablet computers and smartphones at an astonishing rate. Once a middle-aged woman realized she could order 3 different sizes of a dress from her living room, try them on at home, and easily return the ones that did not fit without having to drive to a retail park and queue at the tills, the charm of the physical Wallis store began to rapidly fade. As footfall across the UK's high streets and shopping centres began a slow, terminal decline, Wallis found itself trapped in an aging fortress. It was paying premium rents for physical spaces that fewer and fewer people were visiting, whilst offering products that felt increasingly out of step with the speed and price expectations of the modern consumer. The brand was no longer the elegant destination it had been in the 1980s, nor was it the highly efficient profit engine of the early 2000s. By 2015, Wallis was a brand treading water in a storm, quietly suffocating under the weight of its own obsolescence, completely unprepared for the existential crisis that was gathering over its parent company. As the mid-2000s progressed, the existential threat to the British high street was no longer a distant possibility. It was a daily reality. The digital pure plays were ruthlessly stripping away market share, and fast fashion giants were dictating the pace of consumption. In the midst of this turbulent retail landscape, Wallis found itself paralyzed by a profound, creeping identity crisis. The fundamental question echoing through the sparsely populated aisles of its high street shops was simple, yet devastating. Who, exactly, was still buying clothes from Wallis? The answer revealed a dangerous demographic trap. The brand's core customer base consisted almost entirely of women who had discovered Wallis during its golden era in the 1980s and 1990s. These were the women who remembered the Paris pick-offs, the impeccable tailoring, and the thrill of finding a premium coat that felt like a designer piece. Decades later, now in their 50s, 60s and 70s, they remained fiercely loyal. They returned to Wallis out of habit, trusting the brand for wedding guest outfits, sensible workwear, and reliable winter coats. But relying solely on a legacy demographic is a fatal strategy in the fashion industry. A healthy retail brand operates like a pipeline. As older customers eventually age out of buying new wardrobes, younger generations must be continually recruited to take their place. Wallis had completely severed this pipeline. To a woman in her 20s or 30s shopping in a provincial town centre in 2016, Wallis was entirely invisible. It was viewed not as a destination for accessible luxury, but simply as the shop where my mother buys her cardigans. This generational disconnect was ironically exacerbated by the very structure of the Arcadia Group. Within the corporate hierarchy, Topshop was the undisputed golden child, aggressively targeted at the youth market and showered with marketing budgets, celebrity collaborations, and prime store refits. Wallis, conversely, was treated as the sensible, unexciting older sibling. It was expected to quietly generate cash without requiring significant investment. Consequently, its marketing campaigns felt safe, repetitive, and entirely disconnected from the dynamic visual language of the digital age. The physical reality of the Wallis shops during this period starkly reflected this corporate neglect. If a customer walked into a standalone Wallis store on a traditional British high street between 2015 and 2018, they were stepping into a time capsule of brand fatigue. The glamorous, boutique atmosphere of the past had entirely evaporated. Because the Arcadia board under Philip Green was notoriously reluctant to authorize capital expenditure for store refurbishments, the physical environments were left to slowly decay. The carpets were often worn and threadbare. The lighting, crucial for illuminating premium fabrics, felt harsh and flat, giving the shop floors a sterile, depressing atmosphere. The window displays, once a theatre of aspiration, now seemed to permanently feature red, mid-season sale banners, a desperate tactic to drive footfall in an increasingly empty high street. The stores no longer smelled of fresh tailoring and possibility. They smelled of stagnation. Furthermore, the relentless pressure from the Arcadia boardroom to maintain profit margins, despite falling sales, led to a fatal degradation of the product itself. Wallis was fundamentally built on the promise of quality. But as the 2000s wore on, the accountants took precedence over the designers. The heavy, luxurious wools that had defined the brand's famous mantles were replaced by lighter, cheaper synthetic blends. The intricate linings were simplified. The stitching felt rushed. Even the legendary petite range, which had once required complex, dedicated pattern cutting, began to feel generic, as though standard garments had simply been uniformly shrunk to save on production costs. The loyal Wallis customer was not blind to this decline. The woman who had shopped there for 30 years could feel the difference in the drape of a jacket or the weight of a skirt. The garments were still priced at a premium, positioned as a step up from Dorothy Perkins or Next, but the tangible quality no longer justified the price tag. The psychological contract between the brand and the consumer was broken. Slowly, quietly, the tills stopped ringing. Customers did not stage a dramatic boycott. They simply drifted away. Some migrated to Marks & Spencer, which, despite its own struggles, still offered perceived reliability. Others finally made the leap to online shopping, discovering a world of choice that made the tired rails of their local Wallis feel utterly obsolete. By 2018, Wallis was a brand surviving entirely on muscle memory. It occupied prime retail real estate across the country, but it was hollowed out from the inside. The dedicated shop assistants, many of whom had worked for the company for decades, stood behind their tills in overly warm, underlit shops, watching the footfall on the high street thin out year after year. They were the frontline witnesses to a slow-motion collapse. Wallis had lost its sparkle, its quality, and its relevance, becoming just another faded name on a struggling high street. But the true horror for the staff and the customers was yet to come, because the decay of Wallis was merely a symptom of the terminal disease that was about to bring the entire Arcadia empire crashing down. By 2018, the slow, quiet decay of Wallis was no longer an isolated tragedy. It was merely one symptom of a terminal disease infecting the entire Arcadia group. The illusion of invincibility that had shielded Philip Green's retail empire for the better part of 2 decades was finally shattering. The retail landscape had shifted violently, but the more pressing issue was that the financial architecture of the group itself was beginning to buckle under the weight of historic underinvestment and shifting consumer habits. For the staff working on the shop floors of Wallis, the atmosphere shifted from quiet stagnation to palpable dread. This anxiety was deeply rooted in a catastrophic event that had rocked the British high street 2 years prior: the collapse of British home stores. Although Green had sold BHS for a token sum of £1 before it officially fell into administration in 2016, the subsequent scandal regarding its massive pension deficit had entirely destroyed his reputation. The man once hailed as the undisputed king of the high street was now dragged before parliamentary committees, publicly vilified as the unacceptable face of corporate greed. For a Wallis shop assistant, perhaps someone who had dedicated 20 years of her life to the company, proudly advising customers on petite tailoring and winter coats, watching the BHS scandal unfold on the evening news was a terrifying omen. BHS had been a British institution, a cornerstone of almost every major town centre, and yet it had been allowed to completely evaporate, leaving thousands of loyal staff unemployed and facing precarious retirements. The terrifying unspoken question echoing through the Arcadia portfolio was obvious. If an institution as massive as BHS could be so easily discarded, what hope was there for a struggling mid-market brand like Wallis? As 2018 bled into 2019, the financial realities of Arcadia could no longer be disguised. The empire was hemorrhaging cash. the very strategy that had made the group so dominant in the early 2000s. Total physical saturation of the UK market had become a fatal liability. Wallis, alongside Topshop, Dorothy Perkins, and Burton, was trapped in a vast network of expensive, inflexible leases. Town centre footfall was plummeting, yet commercial landlords continued to demand premium rents, and the government's archaic business rate system ruthlessly penalised physical retailers, while pure-play online competitors operated from comparatively cheap, out-of-town warehouses. In May 2019, the Arcadia boardroom initiated a desperate survival mechanism, a company voluntary arrangement, or CVA. In the unforgiving lexicon of British retail, a CVA is the ultimate distress signal. It is a legally binding agreement in which a company admits it is on the brink of insolvency and begs its creditors, primarily its landlords, to accept drastically reduced rents to avoid total liquidation. The proposal of the CVA sent shockwaves through the UK commercial property sector. Arcadia was asking landlords to accept rent cuts of up to 50% across hundreds of stores, while simultaneously announcing the outright closure of dozens of others. It was a brutal game of corporate brinkmanship. If the landlords voted against the CVA, Arcadia would immediately collapse into administration. If they voted for it, they would take a massive financial hit to subsidise Philip Green's ailing empire. For weeks, the fate of Wallis hung entirely in the balance of these tense, acrimonious boardroom negotiations. On the shop floor, the daily routine of retail became a surreal exercise. Staff were expected to steam garments, dress mannequins, and smile at the few remaining customers, all while knowing that a vote happening hundreds of miles away in London could instantly terminate their livelihoods. The tension was unbearable. Ultimately, in June 2019, the CVA was narrowly approved. Arcadia had secured a stay of execution. But for Wallis, the damage was profound and highly visible. The CVA triggered a wave of store closures across the country. The standalone Wallis boutiques in regional market towns and secondary shopping centres, places where the brand had been a familiar, comforting presence for decades, were quietly identified as financially unviable. The process of shutting a beloved local shop is deeply melancholy. Large, garish, closing down posters were plastered across the windows, completely destroying whatever premium aesthetic the brand had left. Fixtures and fittings were sold off. Staff, many of whom were local women who had built genuine, lasting friendships with their regular customers, were forced to pack up the remaining stock and lock the doors for the final time. The units they left behind often remained empty for months, contributing to the growing phenomenon of the hollowed-out British high street, rows of dark windows where vibrant retail had once thrived. Even the mighty outfit stores on the retail parks, once the invincible fortresses of the Arcadia Empire, began to look vulnerable. The floor space dedicated to Wallis within these megastores was subtly condensed. The stock arriving from the distribution centres felt disjointed and uninspired, a clear reflection of buyers operating under severe financial constraints, terrified to take any creative risks. The 2019 CVA had kept the Arcadia Group legally alive, but it had entirely failed to address the fundamental, structural rot at the heart of the business. They had successfully slashed their rent bills, but they had not fixed the clothes, they had not fixed the website, and they had not repaired the broken relationship with the British consumer. As the turbulent decade drew to a close, Wallis was a skeletal version of its former self. It was a brand operating on borrowed time, shivering in the cold reality of a retail landscape that had completely moved on. They had survived the financial crisis of the CVA, but as the calendar turned to 2020, an unprecedented global catastrophe was gathering, one that would offer absolutely no room for negotiation. In the early months of 2020, the British high street was already a fragile ecosystem, battered by years of declining footfall, exorbitant business rates, and the relentless march of online retail. But no amount of pessimistic forecasting could have prepared the industry for the catastrophic disruption that arrived in March. When Prime Minister Boris Johnson appeared on national television to announce a sweeping national lockdown in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the fundamental mechanism of physical retail was instantly halted. For the first time in peacetime history, all non-essential shops across the United Kingdom were legally ordered to close their doors. For the staff at Wallis, the suddenness of the shutdown was profoundly disorientating. Spring collections had just arrived on the shop floors. Mannequins were dressed in new season tailoring. The rails were fully stocked in anticipation of Easter shopping and early summer weddings. Instead, the lights were abruptly switched off. The heavy steel shutters were pulled down over the windows. Staff were sent home, placed on the government's newly minted furlough scheme, plunged into a terrifying state of suspended animation. The bustling retail parks and the historic town centres were plunged into an eerie, unprecedented silence. It was during this unprecedented freeze that the catastrophic strategic failures of the Arcadia Group were brutally exposed. When the physical high street shut down, consumer spending did not entirely stop. It simply migrated entirely online. Digital pure-play retailers like ASOS and Boohoo experienced a phenomenal surge in sales. Their vast, highly automated distribution centers continued to process thousands of orders an hour. Their websites and mobile applications were seamless, designed for maximum convenience and rapid gratification. In stark contrast, Wallis was utterly ill-equipped for a digital-only existence. For years, the Arcadia boardroom had treated e-commerce as an afterthought, starving it of the massive capital investment required to compete with the modern giants. The Wallis website was notoriously clunky, operating on legacy ET architecture that frequently buckled under pressure. Delivery logistics were comparatively slow and expensive, but perhaps most devastatingly, the core product offering of Wallis was suddenly rendered entirely obsolete by the realities of lockdown life. Wallis was famous for occasion wear, premium heavy winter coats, and sharp office tailoring. In the spring and summer of 2020, nobody was attending weddings. Nobody was commuting to the office. The nation was confined to their homes, trading tailored trousers for elasticated loungewear. The demand for the structured, elegant garments that Wallis built its reputation upon virtually evaporated overnight. Millions of pounds worth of inventory sat gathering dust in dark, locked shops, rapidly depreciating in value with every passing week. As the first lockdown lifted and shops were tentatively allowed to reopen in the summer, the atmosphere was bleak. Customers were hesitant to return to enclosed shopping centres. Fitting rooms, a crucial element of the Wallis shopping experience, were heavily restricted or closed entirely due to hygiene regulations. The traditional joy of browsing was replaced by masks, hand sanitizer stations, and a palpable sense of anxiety. The footfall never recovered. The Arcadia Group was hemorrhaging cash at an unsustainable rate, bleeding out on the high street whilst remaining entirely uncompetitive in the digital arena. As autumn descended, the retail industry looked towards the crucial golden quarter, the period encompassing Black Friday and the run-up to Christmas. For high street fashion, this is typically the most lucrative time of the year, driven by the sale of party dresses, winter coats, and festive gifts. But as a second wave of the virus surged across the UK, a second, devastating lockdown was implemented in November. This was the fatal blow. The Golden Quarter was effectively cancelled. Inside the Arcadia headquarters in London, a desperate, frantic scramble for survival was underway. Philip Green's empire was attempting to secure a £30 million emergency loan to plug a massive hole in its finances and keep the business trading through the winter. But the group's reputation was heavily tarnished. Its physical estate was a massive liability, and its future prospects looked incredibly grim. The loan was refused. The financial cliff edge, which Arcadia had been inching towards for years, finally gave way. On the evening of Monday, the 30th of November, 2020, the unthinkable became a stark reality. News broke across every major British media outlet. The Arcadia Group had officially collapsed into administration. Deloitte had been appointed to oversee the insolvency of the largest single clothing retailer in the United Kingdom. The human impact of the announcement was staggering and immediate. Across the top shop, Dorothy Perkins, Burton, Evans, Miss Selfridge, and Wallis brands, an estimated 13,000 employees, were suddenly facing redundancy. The timing was exceptionally cruel. It was exactly 3 weeks before Christmas. In the middle of a terrifying global pandemic, and the deepest economic recession in 3 centuries, thousands of retail workers were told that their jobs, their pensions, and their livelihoods were in critical jeopardy. For the women who staffed the Wallis stores, the news was often delivered not by compassionate regional managers, but via breaking news banners on their televisions or cold corporate emails. The sense of betrayal was visceral. Many of these shop assistants were not transient workers. They were local women who had dedicated a decade, or sometimes two, to the brand. They had expertly advised generations of customers, maintained the pristine appearance of their shop floors despite severe corporate budget cuts, and loyally defended the brand through the difficult CVA period. Now, they were left entirely in the dark. As the administrators from Deloitte stepped in, a somber mood descended upon the entire British retail landscape. The collapse of Arcadia was not just the failure of a business, it felt like the definitive end of an era. Wallis, a brand that had survived the Great Depression, the Second World War, and decades of shifting economic tides, had finally been defeated. The administrators immediately clarified that there would be no immediate redundancies and that the stores would continue to trade while a buyer was sought for the empire's assets. But the writing was unequivocally on the wall. The closing down signs, the ultimate symbol of high street defeat, were inevitable. The 97-year-old brand was no longer a living, breathing fashion house. It was merely an item on a liquidator's spreadsheet, waiting to be carved up and sold to the highest bidder. The physical legacy of Wallis was over, and the brutal reality of its digital afterlife was about to begin. The opening months of 2021 presented a bleak, almost apocalyptic landscape for British retail. The nation was plunged into its third, and most severe, winter lockdown. The high streets were deserted, blanketed in a freezing, enforced silence. Behind the shuttered windows of the Arcadia Group's vast estate, millions of pounds worth of winter stock hung uselessly on the rails, rapidly depreciating in value. But while the physical shops were frozen in time, the corporate machinery of administration was moving with ruthless, unsentimental speed. Deloitte, acting as the administrators, had one primary objective: to carve up Philip Green's fallen empire and sell the constituent parts to the highest bidders to appease a long line of furious creditors. It was a humiliating end for a conglomerate that had once dictated the rules of British fashion. The Arcadia brands were stripped of their collective power and paraded before a new generation of retail tycoons. The most lucrative asset, Topshop, was quickly snapped up by the online giant ASOS. But the fate of the older siblings, Wallis, Dorothy Perkins, and the menswear brand Burton, hung precariously in the balance. These brands were heavily burdened by an aging demographic and a massive network of outdated, expensive leases. Traditional high street competitors had no interest in acquiring them. They were entirely focused on their own desperate survival. The salvation, if it could be called that, came from a deeply ironic source. In early February 2021, an announcement was made to the London Stock Exchange. The Manchester-based fast fashion conglomerate, Boohoo Group, had agreed to purchase Wallis, Burton, and Dorothy Perkins for a combined total of £25.2 million. To understand the profound tragedy of this transaction, one must understand the absolute contrast between the two entities. Wallis was a 97-year-old heritage brand built on physical craftsmanship, heavy woolen coats, tailored fits, and the tactile experience of browsing a premium high-street boutique. Boohoo, conversely, was the ultimate digital disruptor. It was a pure-play online retailer built on influencer marketing, algorithmic trend forecasting, and ultra-cheap disposable garments designed to be worn once for an Instagram photograph. Boohoo did not understand the quiet prestige of the Wallis Petite range, nor did it care about the legacy of Raphael Nat Wallis's Islington tailoring workshop. What Boohoo cared about was data. When Boohoo handed over £25.2 million, they were not buying a functioning retail business. The terms of the acquisition were brutally specific. Boohoo was purchasing the intellectual property, the brand names, the logos, and the digital rights. Crucially, they were purchasing the customer databases, millions of email addresses and purchasing histories belonging to women across the United Kingdom. They also acquired the remaining warehouse inventory, but they explicitly, categorically refused to take on a single physical shop. The immediate consequence of the Boohoo buyout was swift and devastating. Because the deal excluded all physical assets, all 214 remaining Wallis stores and concessions across the UK were immediately condemned to permanent closure. In the long, turbulent history of British retail failures, the collapse of a major chain is usually accompanied by a highly visible, painful public ritual, the closing down sale. Stores are plastered with garish yellow and red posters. Loyal customers flock to the shops one last time to hunt for bargains, to walk the aisles they have known for decades, and to say a final, emotional goodbye to the staff who have served them. It is a chaotic, undignified, but ultimately communal way for a high street institution to die. Wallis was denied even this final dignity. Because the UK was under strict lockdown regulations in February 2021, non-essential retail was banned from opening. The 214 stores were already locked and dark. When the Boohoo deal was finalised, the shops simply never reopened. There was no final Saturday rush. There were no fond farewells over the tills. For the staff, the cruelty of this silent execution was profound. Thousands of retail workers, many of whom had been sitting at home on the government's furlough scheme, desperately hoping their jobs would be saved, were informed that they would never return to their shop floors. The vast majority of the Wallis workforce, the knowledgeable women who understood the fit of a jacket, who had pinned trousers for alterations, and who had built genuine, lasting rapports with their local communities, were summarily made redundant. A 97-year repository of retail experience and human connection was erased via corporate emails and brief Zoom calls. In the weeks that followed, while the public was confined to their homes, specialist liquidation teams were dispatched to the empty high streets and retail parks. They unlocked the Wallis stores, quietly packed the remaining inventory into cardboard boxes to be shipped to Boohoo's automated distribution centres, and systematically dismantled the shop fittings. Mannequins were stripped and sold for scrap. The display units were dismantled. Finally, the exterior signage, the elegant lettering that had promised accessible luxury to generations of British women, was unceremoniously unscrewed from the facades. Behind those signs lay the faded, discoloured outlines on the brickwork, ghost marks of a brand that had anchored the high street for nearly a century. Wallis, as a physical entity, was dead. It had been cleanly decapitated from its heritage, its properties, and its people. The brand name survived, but it had been reduced to a mere digital tab on a fast fashion website, a ghost trapped within a digital cart. The transition from a proud, tangible institution to a faceless, online-only commodity was complete. But as the dust settled on the Boohoo buyout, the sheer scale of the void left behind on the British high street was only just beginning to be understood. Walk down any typical British high street or through the echoing concourses of a regional shopping centre today, and you will likely encounter the physical ghosts of the Arcadia Empire. Where there was once a bustling, brightly lit Wallis boutique, there is now often a gaping void. Some of these prime retail units have been repurposed into coffee shops, budget discount stores, or charity shops, but many remain stubbornly empty. They sit behind shuttered glass, their windows plastered with fading "To Let" signs. If you look closely at the brickwork or the faded fascia boards above the doors, you can still trace the outline of the distinctive Wallis lettering, a ghostly reminder of a time when the high street was the undisputed centre of British consumer life. The disappearance of Wallis's physical footprint represents more than just the failure of a single business. It is a poignant symbol of a broader cultural shift. For nearly a century, Wallis was not merely a place to execute a transaction. It was a destination. For generations of British women, shopping at Wallis was a deliberate, tactile experience. It was about running a hand over the heavy wool of a winter mantle, examining the stitching on a lapel, and trusting the expertise of a shop assistant who knew exactly how a petite tailored suit should sit on the shoulders. It was the thrill of finding a piece of accessible Parisian glamour in the middle of a grey provincial town. That tangible, human experience has now been entirely erased, replaced by the sterile efficiency of the digital cart. Today, Wallis survives, but only in the most technical sense of the word. If you type the name into a search engine, you will be directed to a digital storefront operated by the Boohoo Group. The logo is the same, the clothes still target a similar demographic, but the soul of the 97-year-old fashion house is undeniably gone. On this new digital platform, there are no hushed aisles or flattering fitting room mirrors. The garments are presented on uniformly lit models against blank white backgrounds, competing for attention in a relentless, algorithmic feed of fast fashion. The brand that once prided itself on meticulous in-house manufacturing in Islington now operates entirely through the outsourced, high-speed supply chains of a modern e-commerce giant. Wallis has been transformed from a proud, independent high street institution into a mere category tab on a website, a disembodied brand name used to sell mass-produced clothing to a database of acquired email addresses. For the millions of loyal customers who sustained Wallis through its golden decades, the transition has been deeply alienating. The woman who relied on her local Wallis for a reliable, well-fitted outfit for a job interview, a wedding, or a funeral now finds herself abandoned by the physical high street. She is expected to navigate sizing charts on a smartphone, order multiple options to her living room, and deal with the logistical headache of postal returns. The communal joy of the Saturday afternoon shopping trip, the browsing, the conversation, the physical discovery, has been outsourced to the solitary glow of a screen. The legacy of Wallis is fundamentally a tragic one, serving as a masterclass in how rapidly a beloved brand can be destroyed when it is starved of investment and stripped of its autonomy. Raphael Nat Wallis built a company founded on quality, craftsmanship, and a deep understanding of what British women actually wanted to wear. His sons expanded that vision, democratizing luxury and bringing European flair to the masses. But the moment the brand was swallowed by the corporate machinery of Sears, and later the Arcadia Group, the countdown to its demise began. Wallis did not fail because the women of Britain suddenly stopped wanting elegant, well-tailored clothes. It failed because it was trapped inside a bloated, complacent retail empire that prioritized the extraction of short-term cash over long-term survival. It failed because a corporate boardroom in London fundamentally underestimated the speed of the digital revolution, assuming that a loyal aging demographic would shield them from the future. When the administrators finally locked the doors of the 214 stores in the bleak winter of 2021, it marked the quiet, undignified end of an era. The coats of Islington, the Parisian dreams of Oxford Street, and the bustling rails of the out-of-town outfit stores were all swept away into the annals of British retail history. Today, Wallis exists as a haunting reminder of the high street's fragility. It stands as proof that no matter how long a brand has traded, no matter how deeply it is woven into the fabric of a nation's wardrobe, it takes only one era of corporate neglect to turn a thriving institution into a ghost in a digital cart. The story of Wallis is not simply a footnote in the collapse of the Arcadia Group. It is a stark reminder of the fragile nature of the British high street. When the final "To Let" signs were erected over those 214 empty retail units, we did not just lose a clothing brand, we lost a physical touchpoint of British consumer history. For nearly a century, Wallis was a reliable companion to the women of this country. It was the destination for the crucial job interview suit, the elegant wedding guest outfit, and the heavy winter mantle that lasted a decade. Retail, at its absolute best, is never just a transaction. It is about community, routine, and a sense of belonging within a local town centre. The knowledgeable shop assistants who understood the intricacies of a petite fit cannot be replicated by a digital sizing chart. The communal joy of a Saturday afternoon shopping trip has been quietly traded for the solitary, frictionless experience of the digital cart. The ultimate tragedy of Wallis is a masterclass in corporate complacency. It proves that an institution can be deeply loved, widely recognized, and still perish if it is starved of investment and stripped of its autonomy. When a business relies entirely on the loyalty of its past to protect it from the future, it is already operating on borrowed time. Wallis survived the Great Depression, the Second World War, and decades of shifting fashion, only to be dismantled by a boardroom that forgot how to innovate. and finally swallowed by the quiet, unyielding algorithms of modern online commerce. As we walk past those empty, shuttered windows today, we are reminded that the history of British retail is intimately tied to the history of our own lives. What are your memories of Wallis? Did you own one of their famous winter coats? Or perhaps you remember shopping there for a special occasion? Share your stories in the comments below as we build a living archive of the British High Street. If you enjoyed this documentary, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a piece of our retail history. Thank you for watching.